So now, if our next speaker is with us, I'd like to introduce Professor Bernardo. Are you here? Professor Bernardo Kastrup. He's the Executive Director of Essentia Foundation. His work has been leading the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. He has a PhD in philosophy, ontology, philosophy of mind, and another PhD in computer engineering, reconfigurable computing, artificial intelligence. As a scientist, Bernardo has worked for the European Organization for Nuclear Research, the CERN, and the Phillips Research Laboratories, where the Kashmir effect of quantum field theory was discovered. And his talk today is on differentiating real intelligence from artificial intelligence. I'd like to now hand over to Professor Bernardo.
Thank you. Just a quick clarification. I'm not a professor. I do have 2 doctorates, but I'm not employed as a professor in any institution. Okay. How long do I have to speak?
About 40 minutes.
40 minutes is the normal, yeah.
Okay. So let me already start by sort of setting your expectations, although I have worked on AI for a long time and it's one of my specialties. I will give a talk on the same vein as Professor Ford, perhaps even more severe in my criticism of the prophets of artificial intelligence than Professor Ford allowed himself to be. So I will just talk freely. This is an unscripted talk. I have so many formal presentations with slides online now over the years. I thought if I do that again, I'll just repeat myself. So I'll try to do something new by just talking spontaneously. I have a list of points I want to cover, but it will be fairly spontaneous. I think the first paper in the academic literature, in the technical literature, that brought up this issue of artificial consciousness or artificial intelligence to the forefront in a coherent, very cogent manner, and already before the discussion became more elaborated, it already brought to the fore the key misunderstandings around it. This first paper was, I think, written by John Searle in the 1980s, in 1980 precisely, I think, and it has become known as the Chinese room experiment. And that's a thought experiment by John Searle. Maybe many of you already know that, but I'll give a quick description of the experiment. Even if you already know it, my description will emphasize the parts I think are salient and relevant, so it may be worthwhile to sit through it anyway. The experiment goes as follows. Imagine that there is a hermetically sealed room somewhere. It has no windows. It has a door, but once you get in, you can close that door and you are hermetically sealed from the outside. You cannot see or hear anything that's going on outside. And inside this room, there is an English-speaking clerk, an administration official. He's just sitting in there inside the room on his desk, and he cannot see or hear anything of what's going on outside. Now imagine also that there is a thin slit on one of the walls of the room through which somebody on the outside can pass notes to the clerk inside. And in turn, the clerk can also pass notes through the slit to whoever is standing outside of the Chinese room. That's the name of the room. And that's the only means for the clerk to communicate to the outside world and vice versa. It's by passing pieces of paper through this thin slit on the wall. Now imagine that there is a Chinese-speaking person outside the room, and this person writes a question in Chinese, using Chinese characters, on a piece of paper, and pushes it through the slit. So the clerk inside gets this piece of paper with a question stated on it. But the clerk doesn't speak any Chinese. The clerk doesn't understand Chinese. So how can he answer the question? Well, and that's the thought experiment. It doesn't matter if what I'm about to say is plausible or possible. It's just part of the thought experiment. Imagine that the clerk has a huge book, a manual about how to process Chinese characters. And that manual tells the clerk that if he gets this or this sequence of Chinese characters, he has to reply with this or that sequence of Chinese characters. And all possible combinations are there in the manual. So the clerk can write down an answer to the question, a coherent answer to the question, and pass it through the slit to the Chinese person standing outside with a coherent answer, even though the clerk doesn't speak any Chinese, doesn't understand any Chinese. All he did was to process symbols blindly by using a rule book, a book full of rules about what to do in case this or that combination of character comes in. What combination of characters do you have to put out through the slit? Now, from the Chinese person's perspective on the outside, every time he states a question to the room, he gets a coherent answer back. The room answers in Chinese. So the Chinese person outside is justified to think that the room is intelligent because the room provides a coherent answer to every question in Chinese put to it. The room must be intelligent because the Chinese person does not know what's going on inside the room. The room is hermetically sealed. All he knows is what messages go in and what replies come out. Now, knowing as we do what's actually going on, do we think that the Chinese room is intelligent? And the appeal of Searle to our intuition is the following. Obviously, the Chinese room is not intelligent because the Chinese room does not understand anything that's going on. The Chinese room is just processing symbols blindly according to syntactical rules. That's all that's going on. Is that intelligence or is just blind symbol processing? So Searle's argument is that complex symbolic processing may give you the impression of intelligence, like when you talk to Siri or Alexa, it may give you an impression of intelligence, but what is actually going on has nothing to do with comprehension, with understanding. It's all about blind symbol processing. Now, do I agree with Searle's argument? No. But the reason I don't agree with it, it's because I think we make very easily a conflation between intelligence and private conscious inner life. There have been many rebuttals to Searle's paper over the years from the MIT and Stanford or other universities, but none of them really succeeds in defeating the core intuition behind the paper. Some of the replies or the attempts at refutation say that, well, the problem is that the Chinese room is not a fully integrated system. Because if the clerk had the manual in his mind and not in a book, if the clerk knew the rules by heart, then there would be a sense in which the clerk sort of knows what he's doing. I don't think it does at all. I think whether you read the rules from a book or whether you know them by heart, you are still doing blind rule processing. So why do I think Searle has failed, even though none of the refutations have succeeded in defeating the core intuition that he's trying to evoke in us? And the reason I think is that the intuition he is evoking is an intuition we have about conscious understanding. That's a content of consciousness. That's a phenomenon of and in consciousness. When you understand something, it feels like something to understand a certain subject, to understand a certain question or an answer. There is something it is like to understand something. In other words, understanding is a quail, or it's made of qualia, qualities of experience. That's what Searle is appealing to. When the clerk just follows the rule in a book, there is no experience of understanding in the mind of the clerk, because the rule book has decoupled information processing from the accompanying understanding, from the accompanying experience of comprehension. But from the outside, the room is indeed intelligent. Why? Because I submit to you that intelligence is a measurable property. It is objectively measurable. We try to do that with IQ tests, which unfortunately are extremely limited. They measure only one very specific nerdish kind of intelligence, and they leave out all other kinds of intelligence. For instance, MMA champions are some of the most intelligent people on the planet, even though they probably would score 100 on an IQ test, which is the average result. Because, you know, MMA fighting is like bullet chess in 3D, in which you have to use every member of your body, you know, both hands, both legs, arms, fingers, the core of your body, everything, head, everything. It requires a tremendous capacity for processing very, very complex situations and reacting to those situations immediately. But that doesn't get captured on an IQ test. So I am very critical of IQ tests, but I think the principle behind them is valid. The principle, or the core underlying assumption, is that intelligence is an objectively measurable capacity or capability. So I know this is just a linguistic point, and in terms of substance, I agree completely with what Professor Ford was saying. But I think getting clarity on the words helps the coach arrive at a more or less coherent understanding of what's going on in the world of AI, which is not the case today at all. So I submit to you that we have to decouple the idea of intelligence, which is just clever ways of processing data. It involves no comprehension, no understanding as qualities of experience. We have to decouple that from the accompanying qualia, the accompanying qualities of actually understanding the meaning of such information processing. The latter requires consciousness. The former, pure intelligence, does not require consciousness. Now, let me just quickly look at my notes. We make this conflation all the time. We mix up the notion of creating an entity that has private conscious inner life with the notion of creating an entity that can process data very cleverly. And therefore, we think that artificial general intelligence is in some way artificial private consciousness. But these two things are not at all the same. Even if you use the words differently than I am using, you should still use two different words for these two things, because they refer to different aspects of the world, different aspects of nature. So as somebody who has done AI, maybe I'll tell you a brief story about my history with AI. I landed at CERN when I was 22, 2 days after I graduated. Working at CERN had been my dream job. And my dream came true two days after I got my diploma. So I was very giddy when I arrived at CERN, very, very giddy and full of energy, full of enthusiasm. I was working in the team that built the data acquisition system for the Atlas experiment. Back in the day, I was responsible for what we used to call the level 2 trigger system, which was the most complex of the trigger systems used in the data acquisition of the Atlas experiment. And I had so much energy that I did my work in two different ways, two different solutions to every problem I got. I produced the classical accepted solution for what we had to do was an algorithm that had to identify useful physics and differentiate it from already known physics. And the reason was we didn't have the capability to store the terabytes of information per second that came out of the experiment. There was no way to store that. So we had to, on the fly, use an algorithm to decide, is this potentially new physics? Is this the Higgs boson? Or is this just electrons and jets and other things that we already know everything about and we don't need to store? So that was my job. And so I produced an algorithm to make this distinction based on physics knowledge, so a human understanding of how the universe works. So you know that a Higgs boson decays in certain ways and not others. It deposits traces about its trajectory, which has certain configurations and not others. It has a certain energy distribution signature when it interacts with a calorimeter. So knowing all that, you can write an algorithm that captures one's human understanding in a machine. But I also, in my private time, using the resources from CERN, but at CERN, you know, you can stay there day and night. Now there are hotels and restaurants and banks inside, so you can live your life in there, and I did. I did have a little apartment outside CERN, but I was hardly there. So I was spending my private time producing an alternative solution to the same problem using artificial neuronal networks, using AI. And I knew it was very clear in my mind, this was back in 96, 97. I knew that an AI solution would never be accepted by the physics community because physicists are proud of their understanding of what's going on. They know what to expect, or they think they know what to expect. So they want an algorithm that captures that knowledge and not a black box AI trained on all kinds of Monte Carlo simulation data. And they don't know what the AI is doing because back in the day, artificial neuronal networks were basically black boxes. We didn't have the visualization tools we have today. But I produced both solutions. Of course, you know, the classical solution is the one that ended up in the Atlas experiment. But it got me thinking about AI because I thought, you know, operationally speaking, as measured from the outside, the AI could be as clever as my classical algorithm. I knew that based on my experiments that the AI could achieve more or less the same level of accurate discrimination as the classical algorithm I was using. Now, you could make valid criticisms about the robustness of such an algorithm. Would it crash if it saw completely unpredicted physics? Because we could only train the algorithm with expectable physics. Would it crash if it saw totally unpredicted physics? Would it throw away a number of Nobel Prizes? And that was a possibility. So that's why we didn't use it. But for the data we did know, it was as clever as the classical algorithm, just much faster at it. So I continued thinking about that. And over the years, in my private time, and now I moved to Phillips Research at some point, and my work was closer to AI, but not really AI. But at home, I continued to think about it. And at some point, of course, you ask yourself the question, if I'm doing an artificial neuronal network that has the same structure and function, or at least comparable structure and function as real neuronal networks, then is there any reason to think that the artificial one, that its operation could be accompanied by experience in the same way as the neuronal networks in my brain are accompanied by experience? In other words, could intelligence come hand in hand with conscious comprehension, conscious understanding? And for a couple of years, as somebody who had physicalist assumptions, you know, I was a physicalist without thinking too much about the problem because I was educated in an environment of physicalists. I mean, my first job was at CERN, the cathedral of physicalism. For 2 years, I operated under physicalist assumptions that there should be a way to set up a particular structure of physical entities so as to create conscious experience that would then go hand in hand with the symbolic processing that we call intelligence. But after a couple of years, I realized that whatever I did, whatever solution I would come up with, whatever structure or algorithm or feedback system or symbolic anchoring of the internal symbols, like I flirted with the ideas of Pentti Haikonen from Nokia Research, which was one of the top research institutes back in the early 21st century. And his idea was that the problem of computers is that they use encoded binary system. So their internal symbols are not anchored in entities of the outside world. They are arbitrarily encoded. So Heikkinen's idea was, no, let's wire each sensor of a computer to a particular entity of the world outside. So there is a wire for smell, there is a wire for a certain color, there is a wire for triangles, another wire for rectangles. So you would eliminate that arbitrary symbolic translation that you get when you go into, ASCII code, for instance. So I flirted with that idea, but eventually I realized that it solves absolutely nothing. And the ultimate conclusion I arrived at was that whatever I did, it would only change structure and function. And there would be absolutely no reason, whatever I did, to think that now I am more likely to create experience than I was in my previous version, the previous version of what I was doing. And at some point you hit your head against the wall so much that you finally realize that you've taken a wrong turn somewhere and you are in a dead end alley. And insisting on that is just stupid. You have to trace your steps back. You have to take a few steps back and sort of take account of where you took a wrong turn. Find your way back to where you took a wrong turn, because the place where I was internally contradictory. My assumptions about the nature of matter and consciousness contradicted the very possibility that structure and function could in some way be associated with consciousness. So that association was impossible because it was an artifact of thought. It was an artifact of my unexamined assumptions. Eventually, I concluded that what is at fault here are the very physicalist assumptions we make about the world. This notion that matter is intrinsically not qualitative, that matter can be exhaustively described through a list of numbers, a list with the right numbers. In other words, you can say everything there is to say about matter through quantities without putting qualities into the mix. And that purely quantitative medium is the bottom level of reality, and everything else arises from it as a kind of epiphenomenon or an emergent property of a foundational level of reality that is inherently and intrinsically and purely quantitative as opposed to qualitative. If you make this assumption, then you will die trying to figure out a way to turn structure and function into qualitative experience. It just cannot be done because it's internally contradictory. Now, I like to use a metaphor to try to describe to you the error we make when we conflate AI with artificial consciousness, when we conflate intelligence with understanding. Notice that most people working on AGI, most people who think that an AGI would be a being with a conscious inner life of its own, most of them, the way they go about their work is by studying how we process information. The subsystems of our cognitive apparatus, they study it. They study, for instance, how you go from electric impulses from your retina to a visual percept wouldn't even be the correct word, but to seeing the world. There are many layers of processing in between these two elements. First, you only have pixels. There are no objects in the world. There are no events. There are just colored pixels. And your cognitive apparatus translates those pixels slowly into separate objects and events, and eventually into narratives. In other words, eventually it translates pure pixels into you telling yourself a story about what's going on around you. So what these people do, they study how our cognitive system does this processing, does these levels of information processing to arrive at a comprehensible narrative about what's going on outside us. And then they try to emulate the same kind of information processing in a computer And the jump they make is then to say, well, if I simulate accurately how a brain processes information, if I simulate that accurately on a silicon substrate, then the silicon substrate will be conscious in the same way that you and I are conscious. But try to see the absurdity of this idea. And to try to illustrate that to you, think about the following, another thought experiment. I can simulate kidney function down to the molecular level in my computer, the computer I'm using to talk to you right now. It's a top of the line iMac with an M1 processor. I can certainly simulate kidney function accurately down to the molecular level on this computer. It would be a perfect, complete, and accurate simulation of kidney function on this computer. Does that mean the computer will urinate on my desk? Well, of course not, because the simulation of a phenomenon is not the phenomenon. It is a simulation thereof. The substrate is completely different. Now, this is very obvious when we talk about urine. Simulating kidney function doesn't cause the computer to urinate. It doesn't matter how accurate and complete the simulation is. We all understand that. It's obvious. The computer is made of silicon. Real kidneys are metabolizing systems made of carbon, nitrogen, water, and all that good stuff related to life. It burns ATP, it does protein folding, transcription, and all that good mitosis, all that good stuff that we call metabolism, and which doesn't happen in the computer. That's why the simulation is totally different from the phenomenon simulated, because what the simulation does, it is to copy a certain abstraction about the phenomenon, not the phenomenon itself. In the case of AGI, the abstraction that is copied are the patterns of information processing. But for the same reason that we don't think a simulation of kidney function will cause a computer to urinate, we shouldn't think that a simulation of the patterns of information processing in a human brain will cause a computer to be conscious, to have private conscious in their life, like you and I have. It is absolutely ridiculous to think that that is the case. So why do we make that mistake? Well, very intelligent people make this mistake. Well, otherwise very intelligent people make this mistake because under the physicalist paradigm, we don't know what consciousness is. It's not only that we don't know, it doesn't fit into the worldview of the physicalist paradigm. It's an anomaly. And since it's an anomaly and we have no good intuition about it, then anything can be consciousness. Maybe consciousness is the involuntary wiggling of my left big toe. It's just as good a hypothesis as consciousness is the patterns of electrochemical firings in the synapses of my brain. I mean, it's a completely arbitrary translation from the world of qualities, consciousness, to the world of quantities, matter as defined under physicalism. There is no natural way for us to deduce, at least in principle, a coherent link between qualities and quantities. That link is always, ever, only arbitrary. Why? Because we created quantities to describe qualities. We created the quantity kilometer to describe the quality of visual perception, distance in visual perception. We created the quality newtons or kilograms to describe the quality of lifting a heavy piece of luggage that weighs 50 kilos. So qualities were created as descriptions of qualities, but physicalism tried to say that qualities can arise out of quantities. This is like trying to pull the territory out of the map. And because we fail in doing that, there is no coherent, natural way to deduce a territory from a map, because the map is the description of the territory, not the creator of the territory. Because of that, we get very confused about consciousness. It's a territory we don't understand. And then it opens the door for all kinds of stupidity and nonsense. And look, the most dangerous kind of stupidity in the world today is the stupidity suffixed by the letters PhD. And there is a lot of it going on, a lot of stupidity with a PhD degree. And you can make some sense of it based on psychology. I have this provocative idea that AGI researchers who go giving lectures around the world saying that they are going to create a conscious being, it's womb envy. You know, Freud talked about penis envy, that women were secretly jealous of this extra thing men had and they didn't have. So I submit to you that what's going on with male AGI researchers who claim that they are going to create conscious artificial life is womb envy. They cannot bring a conscious being into the world like a woman can. So they have to find a technological way to realize that profound human archetype. But it's just nonsensical. It's nonsensical in so many different ways. It's hard to even talk about it, but I'm trying. Now, before I specialized in AI, I was just a computer engineer. I created computers. I still create computers to this day for fun. I make them available for free on the internet, the designs, of course. But as somebody who started in computer engineering, not where people start today, if you go to computer engineering school today, or computer science school today, you already start from abstractions. I studied in the early 90s. I started engineering school in January of 92. We still were taught the very basics. We were still taught how a computer works down to the physical substrate, what is physically going on in the substrate, how semiconductors work, how they are made, you know, how the chemistry of the thing works, because there is chemistry involved. And I know that you can build, in principle, any processor, any computer in the world today, you can make a version of it, in principle, using only pipes, pressure valves, and water. So you would have an enormous 3D structure of pipes and flowing water and pressure-controlled valves, maybe the size of a planet, maybe the size of Jupiter, I don't know. But in principle, you can do anything a silicon computer does with only pipes, water, and pressure valves. A computer is basically an information processing system that uses the binary system of numerical representation, two symbols, on, off. And with pressure valves, you implement a binary system. The valve is either closed or open. Electricity is water, pipes are the wiring. So the way we psychologically become romantic about computers is that it's a mysterious thing going on. It's hidden under an epoxy package with little legs protruding from the sides. We have no access to what's going in there. We only know that it processes information in extremely clever ways that seem to defeat us. I mean, I'm a chess player as well, and I cannot beat Stockfish, one of the home chess engines available today. So if I were not a computer engineer, say if I were my girlfriend who is an artist and doesn't have a background in computer engineer, I would also be romantically enamored with this mysterious technology that beats me at chess, somebody who has been studying chess for, I don't know, 35 years. How is that possible? And because it's a mystery, we project the mystery of ourselves onto it. We project our own consciousness, our own conscious inner life into it. Why? Because it's a black box. It's a mystery. A mystery is a vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum, right? It attracts a projection of something that helps us make sense of it in terms that we can relate to. And what could we relate better to than something like ourselves? And that's why all the romantic idea of conscious computers arise, because people do not understand that those are just mechanisms just like what you can build with water pipes and pressure valves. There is absolutely nothing mysterious about it. And what there is of mystery in it, there are a couple of small, tiny mysteries. One of them is quantum tunneling. through the gate of a transistor. We don't quite understand how that happens. So what do? We prevent it from happening. The whole technology about building computers is shutting off all the parts of nature we don't understand. We call it improving the signal to noise ratio, SNR. That's the technical term for it. We shut out of it everything that we don't understand, so it only does what we do understand. So it is just a bloody mechanism that you can build with water, pipes, and pressure valves. Now, would you think that a construction made of water, pipes, and pressure valves would be conscious? Well, if you think that it would be, then Niagara Falls is conscious. Then the Atlantic Ocean is conscious. And where do you stop? Does the Amazon River have a different consciousness than the Atlantic Ocean? Where does the river end and the ocean begin? So you run into all kinds of arbitrariness of nominal things, nominal assumptions that have no ontic ground in nature. And then you're off to the races. You're lost. Hopefully you find your way back to reason at some point. So the notion of an AI being a conscious being in the sense of having a private conscious inner life as you and I have is internally contradictory. It is as nonsensical as expecting your computer to urinate on your desk if you run an accurate simulation of kidney function on it. But then somebody could say, but Bernardo, what about the correlations between patterns of brain activity and conscious experience? There is no question these correlations exist. Today, we can train an AI to correlate patterns of brain activity of a person with the images that are being displayed to the person on a screen. And that correlation can be found so accurately through an AI that if you're dreaming and they instrument you with an EEG cap, scientists can tell you what you were dreaming of just by looking at your EEG signal. So there are very tight correlations between patterns of electrochemical activation in your brain, namely in your cortex, and consciousness. So that would be then the reason to say if you emulate those patterns, then something like consciousness could arise. Well, I would still say no, because the only way to make that jump is to ignore the substrate. A computer is not a metabolizing system. You cannot ignore the substrate. And another reason is that those correlations do not necessarily imply causation. It's an often repeated logical fallacy. I submit to you, and I will end my talk with this, I submit to you that there is another way to understand the correlations between brain activity and experience coherently without making physicalist assumptions. In other words, without assuming that the brain, that physical entity, somehow creates conscious experience. And the way to do that is to think of the brain not as the cause of consciousness, but as the image of a particular configuration of consciousness. An image of the phenomenon always correlates with the phenomenon it's an image of. That goes without saying. It's self-evident. Flames correlate with combustion. Now, the difference between image and cause is that images don't need to be complete. Causes do. If the brain is the cause of consciousness, then there cannot be anything about consciousness that you cannot trace back to something happening in the brain. And that's a problem, because if you take psychedelics, your brain goes to sleep while you're having the most intense and rich experience of your life. Brain activity dramatically reduces everywhere in the brain. So that's a problem. But if the brain and its patterns of activation are just what a certain configuration of consciousness looks like, then the image doesn't need to be complete. Certain forms, certain types of ethanol will combust without flames. So whatever the image is, you can trace the image back to the phenomenon it's an image of, but not everything about the phenomenon can be traced back to the image. And that fits the empirical data extremely well. So if that is the case, if a metabolizing system is what private conscious inner life looks like, a particular configuration of a spatially unbound substrate of subjectivity in nature, if the brain is an image of private conscious configurations, then artificial consciousness or artificial conscious inner life, private conscious inner life created artificially, is the same thing as abiogenesis, is the same thing as creating life from non-life. Because creating life from non-life is to create a metabolizing system in nature from something that was not metabolizing before. And if metabolism is what private conscious inner life looks like, then creating metabolism artificially is creating private conscious inner life artificially. So if we succeed in creating artificial private consciousness, what will it look like? It will not look like silicon computers. It will look like the ciliates, the paramecium Professor Ford just showed to you. That's what the first artificially conscious AI will look like. Can we achieve it? I think we can. I think we will get there once we understand life better. Maybe I'm wrong about it, but if we do succeed, it will look like that paramecium under the microscope of Professor Ford's. It will not look like a data processing farm. So that's, I'll wrap it up here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kastrup, for your wonderful spontaneous talk. Professor Ford, would you like to make some comments?
Yes, very good. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I doubt whether really there is any understanding of how the kidney works. The kidney is far more complicated than we think. But the general thrust is right, except that when you looked at mitochondria within cells like paramecium, as I have, no one is ever going to make that. It's a dangerous thing to say. Unfortunately, I'm old enough not to be alive to be disproved. But no, nobody will ever make anything remotely like it. And indeed, we don't have to. If you want a paramecium, go out and get one.
Wonderful, thank you. So now we're going to open this second session for questions and answers. So if there's anybody there that would like to ask any questions to any of our speakers this afternoon, we'll welcome them now.
There was a question typed on the chat. I'm not sure. His name is Krishna Kesava. I think on Krishna Kesava, so many names are there. But if somebody can tell their name and they want to tell out this question, you see that in the chat?
Dhanyavad Pranams Maharaj, it is by mistake. I think Krishna Kesava has reflected instead of my name.
Okay.
I am Dr. Srinivasan here.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask a clarification from Professor Sripad relating, he was telling about the life.
Your connection seems to be some problem. Can you read out this question?
Yes, Maharaj, I'll read his question out. It says, I seek a clarification from Professor Butt. Sir, you said life comes from life, and so also matter comes from life. How do you correlate both? Of course, matter has got the latent potency to manifest itself by promoting vegetables, plants, and trees, which are superior to dull matter. Bhuteshu vridubhyaha. Okay, does it have any relationship with Dvaita philosophy? And this is for Professor Butt.
Professor Bhatt is not there, I think, right? In the reading.
Your voice is muted.
Muted? My voice? Can you hear?
No, we can hear you, Maharaj. I can hear you.
Okay. So actually, life comes from life and matter come from life.
There's no
How do
audio.
you correlate both? Of course.
One's not here.
Raj,
My God.
if Professor Butt is joining for the panel discussion, maybe we can save this question for the panel discussion for him.
Yes, that will be good.
Are there any more questions?
I have a question if no one else will ask. Just real quick, we had a comment in the, anyway, you can ask the question from the chat first, if you like.
Yeah, just check the chat. So we have for Dr. Kastrup, we have isn't sleep another form of dissociation which we all experience? The Mandukya Upanishad and Gaudyapad's Karikya seems to be analogous to Kastrup's use of dissociative identity disorder. That was from, I don't know who's that from. Is that the one?
It was Krishna Keshava Das.
Oh.
Can you tell out the name, because the name is also in Krishna Kesava?
Yeah, it's all on him, so it's not saying who it's from. I think they're just replying. Who gave the last question?
Should I answer?
I wrote the question.
The name, your name?
My name is Raman Menon. I don't know why it came up with a different name. There wasn't a way to change it on Zoom like there usually is. And I meant dreaming as a form of dissociation. And it seems very analogous to what Gaudapada talks about in the Mandukya, in his Karika and the Mandukya Upanishad. So I was wondering if Dr. Kastrup had read that or studied that, because it seems to just dovetail unbelievably beautifully with his work on DID.
Okay, this is a question about the broader body of my work, not about the talk I gave today. So for the benefit of the people who do not know at all what you mean, just a quick intro. I mentioned in the talk that I think metabolism or life is not the cause of conscious experience, because that leads to all kinds of internal contradictions, like the nonsense of conscious AGI. But the image of a particular configuration of a substrate of subjectivity that I think is the foundational ground level of nature, a substrate of very simple subjectivity. And metabolism or living organisms are what a certain configuration of that substrate looks like. Now, what configuration is that? Well, we know that living beings have private consciousness in their life. I cannot read your thoughts. Presumably, you cannot read mine, at least under normal circumstances. I do not know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda. So that configuration entails a sort of cognitive isolation from the rest of what's going on in that postulated substrate of subjectivity. And lo and behold, we have empirical evidence for a process that exists in nature that does exactly that. It's called dissociation in psychiatry, extreme forms of which are known in the DSM-5 as dissociative identity disorder. Up to DSM-3, I think it was still called multiple personality disorder, which was a very bad name, a romantic name, but not accurate. So dissociation is when what is essentially one mind seems to split off into seemingly separate centers of awareness, which are inferentially isolated from one another. In other words, you cannot reach somebody's thought by following a chain of cognitive associations. At some point, you face a wall and you have no access to what is beyond that. So that is dissociation. It's the inability to reach a certain content of mind through a chain of cognitive associations. Now, for the longest time, we thought dissociation could be just people faking it. Now, since the turn of the century, definitively that is not the case. You can diagnose DID now with brain scans, which cannot be faked. There was this case in Germany of a woman who had a a dissociative alter who claimed to be blind, and when psychiatrists hooked her up to an EEG cap, when that alter was in control, in executive control of her body, brain activity in the visual cortex would disappear, even though the woman's eyes were open. And when the host personality would be back in executive control, activity in the visual cortex would just pop back and be normal again. So we know dissociation is a real phenomenon, and it can be literally blinding. It can literally preventing you from seeing what is in front of you, even though your eyes are open and there is nothing wrong with your visual system. Dissociation is a purely mental phenomenon in that sense. And so that what living beings, what metabolism is an image of, I would say, is a dissociative configuration of the underlying field of subjectivity in nature. So that's the source of the question. And then the question is, aren't dreams also a form of dissociation? Yes, trivially so. In the dream, during the dream, you identify only with the part of your mind that is doing the dream avatar. The rest of your mind is doing the rest of the dream. It's doing the other people, the streets, trees, cars around, the entire context, environment that your dream avatar experiences from a first-person perspective. But from the perspective of your avatar, you are not doing the world around you. You are inhabiting that world, and that world is a third party. It's out there. It's separate from you. Now, when you wake up, you know that it was your mind doing the whole thing, doing the avatar and doing the rest of the dream. So trivially, during the dream, you are dissociated from yourself. And why do I say trivially? Because there are many non-pathological forms of dissociation. Some of your childhood memories you're dissociated from because they may be things you don't want to remember. Dissociation is a psychological defense mechanism, very well known. And it only becomes pathological when it prevents you from functioning healthily in the world, or when it leads to extreme suffering. That's the only reason we call it a pathology, but it's a question of degree, not a question of nature. We are always undergoing dissociation. When you forget something that you can remember afterwards, you're dissociated from that memory. You lose the ability to reach that memory through a chain of cognitive associations. And people who have excellent memories, not innately, but develop techniques to have good memories, what they do is they engender evocative links of cognitive associations to bring them to those memories. They imagine absurd stories in association with the event they want to remember, or the knowledge they want to remember. So it's all a play of cognitive associations and the dissolution thereof, and then reforming those associations again. Most of it is not pathological at all, and dreams are just one trivial example of a non-pathological form of dissociation.
May I add something, Bernardo?
Of course.
Actually, in Sankhya philosophy and other, Vedic literature, we know that sleep is just like, our gross body is not active, but our subtle body is active. So in the Sankhya philosophy, we have gross and subtle, planes of realities. Like we have this gross body is made up of 5 elements, what it explains: earth, water, fire, air, ether, and then 10 senses, 5 working and 5 knowledge gaining senses. And then the sense objects. Beyond that, these are the gross, reality that we are experiencing. And beyond that, we have, this mind, intellect, and ego, mono, buddhi, ahankar, it explains. So when somebody is sleeping, his gross body may not be active, but his subtle body is active. So what you are, experiencing in the dream, that is the activity of your mind. But there are different states of sleep also. The deep sleep, that yogis and other, practitioners, they experience that. So the turiya state, they experience, the transcendental plane. So of course, sleep also helps in, forgetting some of the difficulties that the individual experiencing in that life. And without sleep, we know that people become crazy. Actually, sleep is very much essential to forget, certain things that they feel like, anxieties and other things that they experience. So this gross and subtle, concept of, that what is explained in Sankhya philosophy, and maybe it's the similar thing that they are trying to discuss. But the meaning has to be understood. The difference in the meaning.
The Western mind and the Western dictionary, conceptual dictionary, our language, lack in subtlety about discerning different states of consciousness. We profoundly lack that. Even I am guilty of that, but at least I'm guilty of that purposefully as a concession to the need to communicate. So I purposefully conflate mind and consciousness because Western philosophy made this conflation already centuries before me. So I try to stick to that, at least to be consistent, and I try to issue disclaimers every time I can. But we clearly, even while alive, go through a great many very subtly different states of consciousness. And we are most likely never unconscious. And the word unconsciousness is another victim of the lack of subtlety of the Western mind regarding mental phenomena. The unconscious was a term used by Freud and Jung, by Freud late in the 19th century, by Jung early in the 20th century. And it was an unfortunate term because what they meant by it, certainly Jung, and I wrote an entire book about it, making that case. What Jung meant by an absence of consciousness was an absence of what we today call meta-consciousness. Consciousness is just raw experience. Meta-consciousness is when, in addition to raw experience, you know that you are having raw experience. It's an explicit assessment of the contents of consciousness, and that assessment in itself is a content of consciousness, or to differentiate it, a content of meta-consciousness, a consciousness that folds in upon itself to assess itself. Now, when you are conscious but not meta-conscious of an experience, you cannot report on that experience to your doctor or even to yourself. Like most of the time, you're not reporting to yourself that you are experiencing your breathing, but you are experiencing your breathing. If I bring your attention to it, you become meta-conscious of your breathing. But 30 seconds ago, you were conscious of your breathing, just not meta-conscious of it. In the case of breathing, we can move freely between consciousness and meta-consciousness. But there are other things that we feel all the time that we cannot bring under the microscope of meta-consciousness, because it may be a psychological defense mechanism to prevent us from doing that. For instance, only in my mid-30s did I realize that I have lived with a certain uncomfortable feeling all my life. But if you had asked me when I was 25, are you experiencing this particular feeling? I would have said, no, of course not, perfectly fine. But when you finally become meta-conscious of it, you remember retroactively that you were conscious of it all along. You just couldn't bring it under the light of explicit introspection. So that's the origin of the unconscious. We may be conscious at all times, even during non-dreaming sleep. And lo and behold, 2 years ago, new research came out in which 3 researchers put forward the empirical likelihood that we are always experiencing something during sleep. And the non-dream related experiences during sleep, there were 3 categories for them: sleep thinking, liminal sleep perception, and selfless states of awareness. And by selfless, is what is meant there is not that you lack subjectivity, but you lacked the idea that you are an individual subject. So you have pure subjectivity. And how they found this out? Well, very uncomfortable research with a great many volunteers who volunteered to be instrumented with an EEG cap and to be awoken by scientists at arbitrary times during their sleep. From the scientist's perspective, it was not arbitrary because the scientists could read the EEG signal of dreaming, and they would not wake the subjects up when they knew the subjects were dreaming. But in the EEG traces where it was clear that the subjects were not dreaming, they would wake up the subject suddenly, and the subject would be primed for it in advance, of course, and to ask the subject to reply very quickly before the memory would fade. Were you experiencing something just now before we woke you up? And subjects would report, yeah, I was thinking about this, or I was feeling cold on the tips of my toes, and there was always something, or I didn't have any particular content of consciousness. I was not thinking about anything, but I was aware. So that's the selfless awareness that doesn't have that individual construct of subjectivity that we call the ego. So we may be conscious at literally all times. We know now that syncope, when you pass out because of oxygen starvation, syncope correlates with very rich experiences. Teenagers worldwide have found this out, and they play a very dangerous game called the choking game, in which they partly strangle themselves to induce what they describe as a psychedelic trip without the drug. And it's a very dangerous game because if you do it alone, you may completely pass out and then be strangled to death. And that has happened to many teenagers. Or pilots undergoing G-force induced loss of consciousness. When they come around, if you ask them, so were you unconsciousness while you were unresponsive? They will report, and I quote, memorable dreams. It's just like us. We dream 4 or 5 times per night. When we wake up, often we don't remember anything. So what we call unconsciousness is either unresponsiveness or the lack of the memory of an experience, not necessarily the lack of the experience. Consciousness may be simple consciousness, not higher order mental functions like deliberation, planning, self-awareness. I don't mean that, but very simple subjectivity, raw subjectivity, I believe, is the foundational level of nature. It is the ground of everything that's going on. And matter is what mental processes look like from across a dissociative perspective.
We have another question for you from, let me just check, Devuti Devidasi. She's asking you, is neural networks very near to natural intelligence? Is intelligence different from understanding and experience?
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make. It depends on how you use the words. Professor Ford used the word intelligence in a way that sort of implicitly folds into it conscious understanding and a form of awareness of the environment. That's valid so long as we know exactly what we mean by the terms. I prefer to reserve the word intelligence for an objectively measurable capability, something that can be measurable from the outside. And the term understanding and comprehension for phenomena of consciousness, of and in consciousness. Now, neuronal networks, when I was working with them, we had relatively poor equipment. Our machines were running at 200 megahertz. This was mid 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. We went to 500 megahertz. Rudimentary stuff. So we could build maybe 4-layer networks, 3-layer networks with very limited feedback loops embedded in them. And those networks were very good for pattern recognition. They were very good for recognizing, for instance, if a calorimeter has measured a Higgs boson or the decaying elements of the Higgs boson or just trivial electrons and jets. What's going on today is what's called deep learning, in which a network can have at least 5 layers. And the first 2 layers that we didn't have in the past automatically perform something that in my time we needed to do by hand, which is called feature extraction, which is extracting from the enormous volume of raw data the characteristics that are salient for discrimination. We had to do that by hand. Today, that's done automatically in these first 2 layers. It's called deep learning, and these networks have loads of feedback mechanisms. Their training and their performance is still largely a black box, although we have better visualization tools today. But it becomes less easy to categorically state that these networks are not intelligent at all, in the sense that I define, or that I use the word intelligence as clever information processing. They can do extraordinarily clever information processing. Some of them can do X-ray based diagnostics better than a physician. It is quite extraordinary what is possible today compared to what is possible when I was, green in this field of study in the mid-90s. If you extrapolate this, I think, and that's the danger, it will become easier and easier for the uninformed, average educated person to differentiate that intelligence, in the sense I use the word, from true comprehension, true understanding. And then you have totally nonsensical proposals put forward as by a philosopher in England whose name shall not be mentioned by me, who wrote entire books about the ethics of dealing with AI. I mean, these are people living in a fantasy world and creating smoke castles in that fantasy world. But technology will evolve in a direction that will make society more and more conducive to this kind of nonsense. And that's a point of concern.
Thank you, Dr. Bernardo. We have another 2 questions. This one now is from Daniel Fernandez. He's asking you, on a societal level, do you see any reasons of concern about the effects of AI on our core subjectivity, or something like algorithms prevailing over human meta-consciousness?
Just to calibrate how long I was spending the answers, how long do I have still?
Krishna Keshava? I think, how long on these questions?
Srila Shanta Maharaj, what time would you like to start the panel discussion?
Another 10 minutes?
10 minutes to answer both questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'll do it quickly. The answer is yes. I'm very concerned because if we start regarding mechanisms, sophisticated mechanisms, but mechanisms nonetheless, which are only different from a construction of pipes, water, and pressure valves, in that they are smaller than that construction would have to be to produce the same kind of behavior. Insofar as we start perceiving these mechanisms as in any sense equivalent to ourselves, in any sense of significance, then we will be guilty of what in theology is called kenosis, an emptying out. In other words, we will make mechanisms of ourselves. We will start we already think of ourselves as mechanisms under the materialist or physicalist ethos, but the development of this technology and of the misunderstanding that intelligence is the same as conscious comprehension will lead to an exacerbation of this kenosis, of this emptying out of ourselves. And I think that has dramatic consequences, not only for our individual psychic health, our sense of meaning, our sense of purpose, our sense of being valid parts of nature and not just a waste of solar energy. And it will also have deleterious effect, even at a geopolitical scale. It will be very easy to deny the humanity of our enemies, which we already do regularly. You know, military training schools aim at doing precisely this, because otherwise we don't shoot at the enemy. You know, the statistics of soldiers who actually aimed at their enemies when they were shooting during World War I is that barely above 20% of them actually try to kill their enemies, because it's so counter our nature to kill another human being. So military training involves sort of bypassing that fundamental instinct so you can be an effective soldier. If we start seeing mechanisms as our equals, this will just careen out of proportion. And I think it can have very dramatic consequences for our social lives, our culture, geopolitics, and certainly deleterious effects on our mental health, our sense of purpose and meaning, and self-validity.
Kanupriya Devi, are you there?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Apologies for that. So I'd just like to then ask the next question. Let's go back here. So this is the question now is from Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute. They're asking you, Bernardo, it is my understanding that you hold fundamental reality to be consciousness. Is the nature of that fundamental reality of consciousness non-dual, dual, dialectic, or something else? What is the relationship between consciousness and personality?
If consciousness is the one, not my consciousness, not your consciousness, not higher level mental functions like self-awareness, self-reflection, introspection, I don't mean any of that. I mean what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, like pure, raw, simple awareness, the awareness of light and dark, for instance, without any higher level mental functions. I understand phenomenal consciousness to be this field that underlies all reality and of which we are part and the rest of the world is a part as well. That fundamental level of reality, because it's one, it's by definition non-dual. Dualism and dialecticism, Hegelian dialecticism at a social level, these are forms of expression of that foundational level of reality, in my view. Out of that one foundational level, the notion of the inside and the outside is created through dissociation. So that's a form of duality, the subject and the object outside. The object is a subject as well, but it's an object from your perspective as a dissociated outer of the whole. So dualism arises as an expression of that fundamental level through dissociation. Dialecticism at a social level is then just a higher level expression in this hierarchy of expressions of the foundational level of reality. And Hegel might have been right regarding the telos of society as a sort of a dialectic instrument for the absolute to know itself by proxy. You know, the absolute sort of splits itself into multiples, so it can dance a dance with itself and know something about itself that it otherwise could not. So Hegel may be right, and dialectic may exist, but it is not fundamental in the sense that it's an expression of that which in turn is fundamental. And if it's unique, it's one and not dual and not dialectic intrinsically. Dialecticism and duality are its expressions.
Thank you. And we have one more quick question. Amir Sindhudas would like to ask Dr. Bernardo a question regarding false multipliers. Would you like to ask your question, Amir Sindhudas?
What does he mean by force multipliers?
I don't know. Well, there he is. There he is.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for magnificent presentation. I just wanted to ask about the notion of AI and then the AGI, the notion of boosters, and then this idea, like to quote, for example, Dr. Ford mentioned earlier on about Alan Turing. So there's a chap called Irving J. Good. He was a British mathematician. He was an associate of Alan Turing. And I suppose his most famous quote was that ultra-intelligent machines could design a better UI machine.
Oh.
Yeah, now, Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. And the idea, I will paraphrase as quickly as possible. We could talk forever. But the question and notion of AI writing its own source code, and then the idea of the philosopher, the Australian philosopher David Chalmers, is that when AI outdoes HI, and all this idea of a feedback loop and the constantly upsmarting itself, blah, 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 woof, woof, woof. You understand all this. So the idea as well, then, what was his name? The technique, the coin of the phrase, the technological singularity, which was a sci-fi writer, Vendor Ving. But the notion then of these kind of cellular nanodrones, and Professor Ford last year also, we had most wonderful, where, for example, the ability of certain worms that exist in the canals, that they get a part of themselves cut off, but they are able to regenerate the cellular thing. And this notion of that holistic, how should I say, interdependency and begins with the letter S. The synchronicity of the cellular experience within itself. So, in other words, then, like where AI goes to do things, and with the program. Anyway, I just go into the. Please, could you just address?
I can comment on it. Yeah.
That notion of the force multipliers and to discount or whatever.
Werner Vinge, he came up with the notion of the technological singularity. I think it was in '93. He wrote also about nanotechnology, but that's a separate thing, nanobots, and it's another vein in Vinge's heritage, so to say. But the technological singularity was then later co-opted by Kurzweil in his 2005 book about the singularity, which is called The Singularity is Near. And the idea that Vinge had and was co-opted by the transhumanist movement is, if you create a computer that can create the next AI more cleverly than you can, then that next AI will be created faster than you could have done it yourself, because computers operate much faster. And then that next AI will be able to create its own next version even faster than the previous one. So the speed of development will grow exponentially. And when it tends to infinity, there will be a kind of technological God. So that's the transhumanist movement's attempt to replace God and maintain a blatant form of religious faith in the context of an apparently secular approach to life. The religious impulse is so strong in people, they cannot get rid of it, even if they are completely secular, because they will project that back on technology. Now, so I think you can take that just as seriously as any religious myth. It's an expression of human psychology. It's not nothing. It's not nonsensical. But when it's expressed and meant to be literal, then you should take it with a whole bag of salt, not only a grain of salt. Something like a AI that can create a better version of itself than we can probably will happen. I don't think it's anywhere near. Kurzweil has predicted it for the 2040s. I think in the meantime, he has sort of pushed that forwards to the 2050s.
Yeah, but, quantum computation.
That's total nonsense. Quantum computing is not generally applicable. Quantum computing only works at all for exhaustive search algorithms like the traveling salesman problem. So problems for which there is no computational shortcut to compute a solution. Problems that can only be solved by testing all possible alternatives and seeing which one works. Now, without a quantum computer, that would take longer than the age of the universe to solve these problems. With a quantum computer, you can solve that in finite time, at great cost and complexity. But quantum computers are not AIs. They have absolutely nothing to do with the kind of computation required for AI. So the notion that quantum computers will speed up some form of AGI is based on an utter lack of understanding of what quantum computing actually is. So we can totally eliminate that. It's not contentious what I'm saying. Not even the proponents of AGI will contest what I'm saying. But it is possible that at some point in the future, an AI will arise that can create a better version of itself than we can, but that will be very late, because although the advancements have been amazing over the past 2 decades, I know what it takes to create anything close to an AI. And there is no AI today that can come anywhere near that. So Kurzweil's extremely naive extrapolation of exponential curves ignores the fact that there are limits in nature, that exponentials do not last forever. Otherwise, we would be traveling close to the light speed today. If you consider that Concorde came out in the early 1960s, we'd be close to light speed, but we are not, because that exponential was not sustained. Now, if you draw an exponential from the Wright brothers to the Concorde, we would be close to the speed of light right now, but we are not. And the same will apply to AI. So it's not something I will see, or our children or our grandchildren, but it is conceivable that there will be something akin to a technological singularity in the future. There is no a priori reason I know of for us to discard that or refute that possibility in principle. It may be impossible in practice. We will only know when we try, and we are trying. But in principle, there is no a priori reason to refute that.
Thank you so much for your explanation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.